Aye.
Hello. Ray goes more deeply in this segment, page 165 of the chapter, The Faithful and Discreet Slave, of In Search of Christian Freedom. He's exploring the class system that now exists in the Watchtower, a clergy that's far more controlling than any of the despised clergy of Christendom, about which the Watchtower has railed on endlessly over the decades. He says, one particularly damaging feature of heavy emphasis on a class is its influencing people to think in terms of fulfilling what is taught in the parable through group membership, rather than being concerned to demonstrate personally the particular Christian qualities set out therein, including faith, discretion, a sense of individual responsibility, watchfulness, or any of the other qualities that Jesus' parables frequently stress. The restricting of the parable's application to 8,800 persons and eliminating its application as regards millions of other members, not of their class, compounds the damage done.
The organizations presenting one view in theory while following another policy in practice, whereby the governing body, to all intents and purposes, becomes the steward, having charge over all Christ's earthly interests, results in the parable's purpose being perverted. Rather than it serving as an exhortation to modest, faithful service to one's master and one's fellow servants, it is used principally as the means to demand unquestioning submission to the governing body's direction.
Illustrating this, in one governing body meeting, Grant Suter quoted a Watchtower missionary as having said to him, quote, "There is a faithful and discreet slave. Once we find out who he is, from then on it is simple. Just do what he says. If he is wrong, he is responsible to God." That's the end of the quote. Governing body member Suter manifested obvious approval of this attitude. Yet the idea that some collective group, through its leadership, can bear the responsibility for what we as individuals do, simply because we unquestioningly follow their directions, is totally false and contrary to what the Scriptures teach. It is the same philosophy that enables men to commit acts that are contrary to what is true and right, and perhaps contrary to their conscience, and then seek to excuse themselves of responsibility by saying that their political or military or commercial leaders told them to do so. The Scriptures are clear that when we stand before the judgment seat of God in Christ, we stand as individuals, and as individuals answer for what we have done.
When this general subject surfaced in one governing body session, I raised the question of the validity of insisting on restricting the application of Jesus' parable to the classes in the way that the organization uses the term. If this was right, then such application should be consistent, not arbitrary. Did we say then that there is a 10 mina class and a 5 mina class in applying the parable found in Luke 19 verses 12 to 27? If so, who were or are they? Surely that identification would have to be determined not on a group basis, but on an individual basis. And in reality, only Christ could make such an identification. The same might be said regarding Luke chapter 12 verses 47 and 48, in which Jesus says, quote, "Then that slave that understood the will of his master, but did not get ready or do in line with his will be beaten with many strokes. But the one that did not understand, and so did things deserving of strokes, will be beaten with few." End of quote.
Were we then to say that there is a many strokes class and a few strokes class? If so, who were or are these? Again, this would have to be determined not on a group basis, but on an individual basis, being discernible and determinable only by the Master, who can read human hearts and who will reward each person according to what he's done, according to Matthew 16 verse 27. Certainly no one can claim that there is or has been some specific identifiable group or class joined by organizational ties, membership in which would serve to identify one as part of the many-stroked class or of the few-strokes class. The Watchtower Society does not choose to employ their practice of class application here. Yet this section of Luke is the same one in which Luke presents the parable of the faithful and discreet slave, found in Matthew chapter 24. Surely logic should call for a consistent class application. I brought up these points in the session, but there was no response from any of the governing body members. As was so often the case, discussion simply shifted to other matters. Now there is a footnote on page 167 in which Ray says this: the same principle would apply with regard to the evil slave of this same parable. The Watchtower speaks of an evil slave class, yet those persons they label as among such do not all belong to some particular organization, do not form a distinctive composite body. Any individual of the anointed who withdrew from the organization and subsequently published information unfavorable to the organization would be classed as an evil slave, even though he were to act simply as an individual. How can this be so in this case, and not in the case of one who fits the picture of the faithful slave in the same parable? In other words, highlighting the inconsistency in the Watchtower's application. Now, in the next segment, personal individual responsibility, Ray goes much deeper into how the accountability, according to the scriptures that Ray is concentrating on here, is on the individual. We will all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, Paul says more than once. In the next segment, each one, each knee, as Paul says elsewhere, every knee will bend down and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.
Amen.